Welcome to this final session of our short course in Methodist Church history and theology, What, So What, Now What. In session 1, just to recap, we looked at John Wesley's heart-warming experience of 1738 and considered what had happened in his life, his family background, and the wider cultural and church context that led to that moment. In session 2, we considered early Methodism, which we argued was largely a renewal movement within 18th century Anglicanism. John Wesley never set out to set up a whole new thing called the Methodist Church. He wanted to renew the church of his day. We considered John Wesley's engagement with field preaching, and then the development subsequently of various mechanisms that led to the flourishing of the movement. In session 3, we reflected on the creation of the separate denomination which arose after Wesley and considered the ways in which it fragmented at first and then grew over the first half of the 19th century, journeying then through the years to 1932 and the creation of the modern Methodist Church in Britain. In session 4, we considered how Methodism flourished elsewhere. We went on a kind of a global tour of America first, then Africa, Asia, the Pacific, South America, and Europe, and drawing some conclusions about why Methodism developed the way it did in each context. That led us to our 5th session, when we looked at Methodism in Britain since 1932 and its distinctive theological emphases. In this final session, we focus on how the work of the Methodist Church in Britain has been moved forward and led in the past and how it might move forward from this point. The Bible bears witness to numerous ways in which leadership took different forms and expressions as the missional context and the call of God required. Joshua offers a different form of ministry to Moses as they move from the wilderness wanderings to settled living in the land of Canaan. The judges then follow, and their form of leadership needed to be raised up to back external threats. Then you have the prophet, Samuel, the role of prophets in the land. And Samuel, as you remember, is asked to provide for the people a king so that they can have the form of leadership that other nations around them have. There is no other form of leadership there's no one form of leadership in the New Testament either. You have Jesus, like other Jewish rabbis, who has a group of disciples. Those disciples become apostles and offer in Jerusalem a kind of a collegial approach and democratic approach to leadership. In the book of Acts, chapter 6, we see the early church developing a new form of ministry for a growing church, namely the role of the deacon. The conclusion that could be drawn from these biblical instances is that the forms of leadership and ministry that emerge in any given context of time and place will have both a level of continuity from what has gone before and also a particularity to address the needs of the new missional season. So we have found this to be true of the early Methodist movement in our earlier sessions of this course. John and Charles Wesley were ordained Anglican ministers and whose ministry had been shaped by the Anglican Church of that period. Other influences, we said, shaped John's own distinctive ministry, including Pietism, Puritanism, Orthodoxy, the Holy Club, the aborted missional experiment of mission in America, and the stimulating encounter with the Moravians. The very direct and decisive departure from normal ministry came at the invitation of fellow Holy Club member George Whitefield when he asked him to share in the open-air field preaching. John does so reluctant. Remember, he submitted to become more vile. The people hear the gospel and they respond. This creates a problem for him. It's first of all a theological problem, For the Calvinist Whitfield, he could just say, well, go your ways. You're now saved, and clearly God has chosen you to be one of his. You'll be saved for all eternity. Whereas Wesley was what's called an evangelical Arminian, following the teaching of Jacob Arminius from a century before, who'd sort of not liked that picture of a God who saves some and condemns others, but invites them to make a decision instead, to respond to his love, which is for everyone. So because of this, he felt the need to develop people in their discipleship journey. Great that you've become saved, that you've responded to God's love and you've invited him into your life, but now you need to grow. And so he needed to help them on their discipleship journey, enabling their growth in holiness. It's a practical problem also, in that there are, as we said a previous week, insufficient pews in the country for the growing population, and so he can't just send them back to the Anglican Church. And also insufficient priests to support his particular theological or missional perspective. He's ministering here in a way that is different from most of his colleagues in Anglican ministry at the time. Their formation had not prepared them, or the Wesley brothers for that matter, to operate otherwise. The question that arose for Wesley and his supporters was essentially, how will we resource and shape support this rapidly growing community of people who are committed to growing in their faith and their newfound faith? In the open-air preaching, and soon in the means and methods that he develops to support the growth of those who respond, namely bands and class meetings, societies, the annual conference, the assistants, later the superintendents and the local preachers, Wesley demonstrates innovative leadership. He's a great organizer. One significant example of his entrepreneurial approach, his creative approach, is in the ordaining of Coke and Asbury that we looked at about 2 weeks ago. He ordained Coke and Asbury to be superintendents for the American work. Wesley provides for them not only ordination, but also gives them liturgical and theological resources they will need for the life and work of the church there. They in turn find that the tools that Wesley had provided them needed amending for their very different and changing context. And so they minister in a different way, in a different context. So in Acts, in the Old Testament examples given, and in the early Methodist movement, we see that new forms of leadership and ministry are required for a new generation and missional context. So what about now in the context of contemporary Britain? The world in which we live is variously described. For example, some speak of post-modernity. Others lament the reality of post-Christendom. However, essentially whatever description best describes our present and ever-changing reality, it might be best described as fragmented, and certainly very different from the one in which we and many in post-Second World War Britain grew up in. British theologian Peter Ward describes the radical change in this cultural context as the difference between solid and liquid. This is a different missional context to the one that gave rise to Methodism and the Methodist Church in the 18th century. It requires a differently configured church and ministry to lead it and help it fulfill its mission. This leads to the question, what sort of church does the mission of God require now? Moreover, what kind of leadership and forms of ministry will be required to serve it and resource it going forward? These questions are too big to contain in one short podcast like this one, but hopefully in the conversations that we had last Tuesday night and in the conversations we will have in the days ahead, we'll be able to look together at these questions. Furthermore, we do have resources in all kinds of different theological voices. Theologian Helen Cameron from the Salvation Army, who's a lead in this country in practical theology, speaks about the different voices, the different theological voices. One of those voices is what we call the um, ordinary theology. Ordinary theology is what people actually think. And to that end, last week, I got you to do a little survey and to think about the question of what you understood by minister and ministry, and whether you consider yourself to be a minister or not, or to have a ministry. So that provided rich data that we reflected upon on Tuesday night. But as well as that, we have, if you like, the espoused theology of the Methodist Church. And that is what it says in its theological documents, like the conference reports. And there are some really good ones. If you go online onto the Methodist Church website, you'll find one called Call to Love and Praise from 1999. And then you'll find other ones like what is a minister, what is a presbyter, what is a deacon, ministry in the Methodist Church report of 2018, flexible patterns of ministry, you name it. There's all kinds of reports on and reflections on ministry and mission and leadership of the church over the last 25 years or so. Well worth going and looking at. So that's the espoused theology. There's also what you call the operant theology, and that's what we do. What does the church actually do in terms of its operations, and how do we best see what we believe acted out in reality? And then there's also what you call formal theology, which is the theology of the academy and the textbooks that sit on the shelves behind me, or I should say in front of me here along my windowsill, because they're out ready for me to do further work on these questions in the essay that I'm writing over the next few days. So the question remains, what sort of church does the mission of God require now? What kind of leadership and forms of ministry will be required to serve it and resource it going forward? This brings us to the end of the course, and these questions are at the heart of the research I feel called to do, and they are crucial for us as a local church seeking to respond in authentic and effective ways to the gospel of God's love in Christ, and to live out our discipleship in worship and mission here and now. So God bless you. Thank you for sharing in this course with me, and I look forward to sharing with you again in another course on another topic. Watch this space. God bless.